Hello on another episode of APORDE podcast. I have a lovely guest today. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Oh, thank you very much. My name is Mwangi Wa Gĩthĩnji. I'm a political economist working at the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Lovely to have you here. My first question, you sent me the trilogy of a book you wrote called Decolonial Reconstellations. If we look at volume 2 titled Dissolving Master Narratives, do you feel there are master narratives we need to dissolve as Africa regarding the just transition? And if there are, how can we dissolve them for our own continental development?
Thanks so much for that question. First, let me say a little bit about Decolonial Reconstellations. So Decolonial Reconstellations is a 3-volume work which I co-edited along with Laura Doyle and Simon Gikandi, both who work in literature. So it is a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary piece of work that includes 28 essays from 33 contributors from 8 different disciplines. And it's been a long-term work trying to bring together people from different disciplines to have a conversation. So these essays were not written in isolation, everybody in their corner and just writing an essay, but were written in collaboration where we had meetings and we gave each other feedback and conversations on the work. And in that sense, the volume is pretty unprecedented, and our ability to actually bring them out all together at the same time this year was unprecedented. So how does this speak? How is this related to this question of master narratives? My view of what does it mean to do decolonial work or decolonial studies, and particularly with respect to development and economics. I think the first thing that one comes to is that the idea that there is a model of development, or particularly the idea that Europe or the West more broadly represents modernity, and there is a single path to development, is what we question, right? This is not to question the idea that there are successes in this path, but that there is a single path to development. If you carefully examine history, you'll find that different places have taken different paths, even if they have some commonality. They've taken different paths through the process of creating a better world for their citizens. And so for me, first of all, you ask what might be a definition for development. So a definition for development might be expanding the possibilities for your own population. And that doesn't have to be characterized by particular industries, right? Or particular ways of living, but just the fact that you expand the possibilities for your population. So for me, it is a lot about understanding your own local context, your history, and how in this particular time you can expand the possibilities, the well-being of your population, right? So here, when I say that there isn't one path, when we think of Africa at this particular time, you have to think about how do you expand these possibilities at a time when we have a global environmental crisis, right? We have more or less accepted liberal democracy, or at least liberal multi-party electoral systems, okay? And you have the rise of Asia, particularly China and India, who also have large populations of people who, and therefore can produce lots of goods and services at relatively low cost, right? As an example, these are not restrictions East Asia, for example, faced, right? And if you go further back to the beginning of industrialization, questions that England faced. So when they were doing the development, they could pollute, for example, right? They could just use coal power without worrying about the impact, okay? We can't do that today. So how do we now industrialize in this context of an environmental crisis? We're in a different situation than they were, so we need to take that on board, okay? When East Asia industrialized, there was extreme labor repression. The problem of transformation, of economic transformation, often it's a painful process, right? And the problem of creating an industrial workforce, for example, can be painful, and controlling wages. But now we live in a multi-electoral election system. So you have to have a different negotiation to make industrialization possible, because you can't do it by simply oppressing the working class and squeezing them for lower wages and hoping that that way you will get industrialization. There's a different conversation that has to take place in the country. So the first thing for us is to recognize that improving the well-being of our citizens requires us to take the global context as it is today into the argument, and also to understand our own histories and to understand our own strengths and our own weaknesses, and not simply try and replicate somebody else's model. Yes, there are things we can learn from the historical experiences of other countries, but we can't simply replicate those models. We have to think carefully about what we can do in our own time.
If you're looking at the African continental free trade, some view it as a game changer for African industrialization. But will the removal of tariffs, because I guess that's been the barrier, will the removal of tariffs alone drive structural transformation, or does it risk deepening uneven development between countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's great that we now have the African free trade area and the attempt for more collaboration between African economies. But I think you're right in suggesting, I think in the question, that a simple removal of tariffs between countries does not necessarily lead to the structural transformation, at least of all of Africa, and can actually lead to increasing differences or uneven development between countries. We know, if you look at various countries, you can divide the continent into 3 or 4 regions. And in each of these regions, there's often what you might call a pole economy or a leading economy, whether it be South Africa in the southern part of the continent, Nigeria in West Africa, Kenya in Eastern Africa, Egypt probably in Northern Africa. And simply opening boundaries or opening borders, or at least in this case just for goods, because it's not doing so for labor, doesn't necessarily lead to even transformation across the continent. So it might just mean that South Africa becomes a manufacturing hub for much of Africa, okay? And then another country can dominate in another area. But countries which are poorer might remain poor. They've just replaced imports from one part of the world to imports from within Africa. So I think for it to be effective, we have to have a deeper conversation about what are people going to build. And they must be give and take. So South Africa must be willing to allow that there'll be industrialization in other countries in the southern region, which South Africans will then purchase goods from, as will other countries, right? we must, in some sense, plan what are the industries and where will industries be placed. And so we don't end up in competition with each other. If we all try to produce cars, we all end up competing with each other. And then the few that survive, benefit and the others don't. So I think it's more than simply lowering the trade barriers. We must have a continuing conversation about economic integration, right? And that's a difficult conversation to have, because economic integration also means you give up some of your political independence as a single nation, right? Because you can't, if you're going to have joint economic policy, it means you're restricting yourself as to what you can do, right? And as you can see, for example, in the case of EU, they reached a point where Britain decided that people felt that they had to leave the aspects of the European Union. I mean, there is some regret now, but, there's a give and take. So these are conversations we must have, and we need to accept that a free trade area can lead to losers. It's not a win-win for everybody automatically. And so we have to carefully think about how do we advance with this agenda, and if we cannot balance out the growth, how do we compensate those who are losing? Otherwise, at some point, there'll be tensions which will be created that will lead to some countries saying they want to leave any such area.
I mean, can we at least start somewhere, maybe to say, in all of Africa, maybe South Africa picks Kenya, for example, and says, I could work with you for whatever reason that makes us maybe like-minded politically, or you do not have industries that are struggling so much, or your industries where you have strength, maybe like agriculture, complements my situation in South Africa. And then those that can easily come together, build strength, and then they start to allow in other countries that might have not been maybe an obvious choice to align with.
Yeah, the question is, so if you take the case of South Africa and Kenya, so in fact, for a long time, South African and Kenyan capital have been in competition for the East African market, for example. Okay. So in fact, the capitalists are not themselves ready to actually unite. So they still see themselves in a kind of nationalistic way, and want the government to protect them and advance them. So it's more complicated. I mean, I know that one time the Kenyan president, when both South African Airways and Kenya Airways were having problems, tried to get them to come together, because both of these airlines in the past had been successful, to collaborate, right? That didn't go very far. So we need to somehow bring down the idea that we are competitors. Okay, that's why I'm saying that you can't just take the leading nations and expect them to collaborate without bringing in the other nations. Because really, what we're interested in both cases is South Africa and Kenyan capital in this case is looking at Tanzania and Uganda and Zambia and Malawi as markets, and then engaging in a competition over those, right? And those countries themselves want to develop their industries. It's not, they don't want to just buy South African and Kenyan goods. So I think from the get-go, you have to have a broader conversation. You have to say, okay, whatever it is that South Africa is sending to us, South Africa is allowing us to send this other thing into South Africa. And as a region, we are saying, yes, Zambia is very good at producing this, and we are not going to go into competition in that area because it makes sense for us, because Zambia can produce a certain good the cheapest, that we allow them to be the hub of doing that. Okay? And then, other things. So everybody must get an opportunity. Otherwise, nobody wants to be just a market for other countries. And so that's a difficult conversation we must have. So, recently, for example, although we have an East African community, Tanzania banned what it called foreigners from owning small businesses in Tanzania. Okay? Now, that actually goes against the dictates of the East African community, which allows free movement of labor between countries and allowing East Africans to set up businesses within the region. Okay? But what they found is that, particularly in this case, it was seen as this was, was focusing on Kenyans, is that Kenyans had, for whatever reason, easier access to capital, sometimes more education, and came in and set up businesses that outcompeted the local businesses. Okay? That's a real concern for the Tanzanian government. Okay? Now, I'm not agreeing with them in the sense that they had signed an agreement already that allowed for this free movement. So rather than just canceling it, there should have been an attempt to figure out, when we're signing these agreements, what does it mean for our own population? And how do we make it possible to further integrate while uplifting our own population? Normally it's easier to go forward in small steps rather than taking big steps forward than having tension that pushes the whole project backwards. Okay? So these are the challenges that we face in this process of integration. And, it means that you can't have singular industrial policy. You have to have conversations across countries. Right? So it makes it more complicated.
Regional policy, maybe? Not continental policy?
It depends on where you want to start. I think you can start regionally because it's always easier to have conversations with economies that are much more similar, or at least have some historical connections. So, but you can start maybe with continental principles, some principles, and then come to regional policies, right? And then try and figure out how you expand those regional policies to engage the other regions.
We have to end here and say goodbye to our listeners. Thank you for joining us today on our podcast, Professor Mwangi.
Thank you very much.